300 pieces of music. A career as an ordained priest. With the energy of a brilliant violinist. Today, on the History Chronicles, we will be looking at the life and times of Antonio Vivaldi. Antonio Vivaldi was born in 1678 in Venice on the 4th of March to his parents Camilla Calicchio and Giovanni Battista Vivaldi, a barber, a baker and violinist. On the day that he was born, it was said an earthquake shook Venice. In the highly religious context of the time, this may well have been the reason behind Vivaldi's immediate baptism into the Catholic Church. Religion was to define Antonio Vivaldi's life. As was usually the case for the eldest son in a wealthy Venetian family, Antonio was to enter the church. He was ordained in 1703 after completing the 10-year-long training for the priesthood. It was also in 1703, however, that he took up another job that was to define his legacy even more than his priestly credentials. This job was at the Ospedale della Pieta in Venice. The Ospedale was an institution that was set up to care for girls born out of wedlock who were often left to roam the streets of Venice as orphans. The Ospedale was one of 3 such institutions in Venice, in total housing nearly 6,000 girls at any one time. Part of the reason for this huge number of so-called illegitimate children was the abundance of prostitution in Venice in the 17th century. Venice at this time was an incredibly busy port. It had been since the Middle Ages. With the incoming and outgoing merchant ships came a great number of men seeking pleasure, and the number of prostitutes in the city in Vivaldi's time numbered almost 12,000. The Ospedale and its sister institutions provided a broad education for their charges. Vivaldi's work was to teach the girls the violin. This he did with great aplomb. Every week the girls of the Ospedale would give public performances, playing from behind a screen so that they avoided the public gaze in accordance with the laws of the Catholic Church. The weekly concerts took place in the Church of the Pieta. In these holy grounds even applause was forbidden. The crowd simply had to shuffle their feet or cough to show their appreciation to the musicians. For his weekly concerts, Vivaldi began to write music for the girls to play. Indeed, a great deal of Vivaldi's compositions appear to have been written for this purpose, including some of his most famous works, L'Estro Armonico, the Harmonic Inspiration, and Le Quattro Stagioni, the 4 Seasons. As he played, Vivaldi's distinctive long red hair and clerical robes swirled around him, and he soon gained the name El Prete Rosso, the Red Priest. But his popularity with the crowds did not sit particularly well with his employers. Twice he lost his job at the Ospedale when his contract was not renewed. However, both times he was eventually reinstated. The second time this happened, he was granted the role of director of music, allowing him to have even more freedom in his musical creativity. This role was also beneficial for Vivaldi because, as director, his attendance at the weekly concerts was no longer mandatory. He could travel, and travel he did, to Mantua, Verona, Milan, Florence and Rome at first. At Mantua, Vivaldi gained the position of Maestro di Cappella at the court of the local prince. There he lived for 3 years and benefited from the lavish performances of several of his operas. It was in Mantua that Vivaldi also composed the 4 Seasons, 4 pieces for solo violin and strings that describe each of the seasons of the year. Vivaldi visited Rome numerous times, and in 1723 he even gained a private audience with the Pope to give him 2 violin recitals. Here in the Vatican he also made friends with Cardinal Ottoboni, who went on to champion Vivaldi's work, just as the Cardinal had done with another, earlier Italian composer, Arcangelo Corelli. In the 1720s, Vivaldi's fame as a composer and performer spread beyond the Alps. His music was warmly received in France. Although he never visited the country, he composed a special cantata for the court of King Louis XV called La Senna Festagiente, The Seine Rejoices. A cantata is a choral or a sung piece of music which in this case Vivaldi tailored to the fashions of France. He included characters such as Virtue, who was searching for true happiness, and even the River Seine itself, which is a character in the cantata. Vivaldi also found popularity in the court of the Habsburgs in Austria. In 1728 he presented the Habsburg Emperor Charles VI with a set of 12 concerti and was rewarded in turn with a gold medallion in addition to the payment of a large sum of money. From Vienna in Austria, it is likely that Vivaldi also toured Prague, performing concerts and having his operas staged there. The composer's output was immense. He composed almost 2 operas per year from 1713 to 1738, one of which seems to have been composed in just 5 days. He also wrote a great number of sacred works, one of the most famous of these today being his Gloria that was composed around 1715. Of the greatest fame, however, are Vivaldi's concerti. He appears to have composed over 500 of these pieces, written to highlight a single or group of solo instruments, as Le Quattro Stagioni, the 4 seasons, did so well with the violin. With the concerto, Vivaldi took a form of music that was already popular in Italy and dramatised it even further. Many of these pieces were written for a single string instrument, such as the violin, the cello, or even the guitar at times. They were accompanied by a group of strings and a keyboard called the continuo. Concerti showcased the virtuosity of the soloist and, no doubt in Vivaldi's own concerts, this was often himself. He was known for his fiery style and vanity, suggests one of his biographers. That said, the music of a Vivaldi concerto is also reflective of his origins back in Venice. The large group of strings, continuo and solo arrangement of this music was an ideal learning ensemble and proving ground for the orphaned girls of the Ospedale. And indeed, despite Vivaldi's huge productivity and success, he stayed true to the roots of his success. Vivaldi reached an agreement with the Ospedale's directors in 1723 so that he could travel to Europe to perform as long as he returned each year to the Pieta to write and perform 2 concerti per month. This he did diligently into his 50s and 60s, despite apparent poor health that had riddled him for most of his life. But, like all things, musical tastes were subject to the whims and fashions of the time, and as Vivaldi aged, he found it harder to gain an audience for his music. In 1740 he travelled once more to Vienna, seeking work from the Emperor Charles VI, who had before done so much to popularise his music. However, the Emperor unfortunately died from the consumption of poisonous mushrooms, and thus Vivaldi's music too fell out of favour at the royal court. Vivaldi died a poor man in Vienna in July 1741, and, like Mozart half a century after him, he was buried in a pauper's grave. Nevertheless, at this period in European history, unless you were born into a noble family, such a burial was usually the case. What is more significant about Vivaldi was the simultaneous death of his music. Whereas Arcangelo Corelli, an Italian composer of the 17th century, had his music performed in annual memorial concerts by his students for years after his death, Vivaldi's music faded into obscurity in the 1700s. It was not until the 20th century that the composer's music was revived. The violinist Fritz Kreisler began this process, writing a concerto in the style of Vivaldi. In 1926, 14 volumes of Vivaldi's work were discovered at a monastery in Piedmont that contained a vast amount of Vivaldi's concerti, operas and sacred works. The Italian conductor and composer Alfreda Casella organised the Vivaldi Week in 1939 that shed even more light on masterworks of the 18th century Red Priest. Today, Vivaldi's works are performed regularly in concert halls throughout the world. The opening bars of Vivaldi's Spring from the Four Seasons are featured in everything from TV adverts to mobile ringtones, perhaps regrettably. Nevertheless, at least today we can enjoy Vivaldi's music and relish in the legacy of this masterful composer.